there's such a lot of distortion, ignorance, lack of understanding of the context of what's going on, really. And, you know, being an Israeli diplomat is not easy, because you're on a daily basis being questioned about your right to exist. And Israel has to explain day in, day out why we are the only Jewish state and why we have a right to exist in peace with our neighbors. But evidently, this message is having a hard time getting through. But I appreciate you bringing a more balanced approach to all of this.
Rita.
I'm interested in what you think is going to happen around the world with this latest conflict. We've seen an exodus already in the last couple of decades from Belgium and France and places throughout Europe. Do you think something similar will happen in North America with these attacks we're seeing against Jewish people for being Jewish? You know, people just standing around being attacked, people having dinner outside a restaurant, being spat on. It really is such ugly anti-Semitism. Do you think it's going to lead to people leaving those areas and not feeling safe there any longer?
Well, we very much hope not. Israel is the Jewish state, the state of all the Jews, and is a safe haven for all Jews. That was the reason why it was established, so the Jews all over the world would feel secure. But having said that, I think all these democratic countries have a great responsibility to take care of their societies and their citizens, because what begins with anti-Semitism, what begins with the Jews, doesn't end with the Jews. And so I think that to maintain the fabric and the sustainability of these democratic societies, they have to prevent Jews from having to leave their countries. Absolutely.
James.
Ambassador, I want to ask you about this ceasefire which has been announced and which seems to be tenuously holding at the moment, although I've seen some reports that there are still little outbreaks of violence. Isn't it so long as Hamas exists and is backed by Iran that this is going to still be an existential problem for Israel, that they still have thousands of missiles all over the place ready to fire at a moment's notice and at the slightest provocation? What guarantee do you have that this ceasefire won't end in the same situation of Hamas firing thousands of rockets, Israel defending itself, and Israel taking the blame in the world media?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is an existential threat not only for Israel, but for the Palestinians and for all the countries in the region. As long as Hamas exists and as long as Hamas calls for the destruction of the State of Israel, there will not be peace in the region. What we need to focus on really now is ensuring and getting the correct arrangements for a sustainable long-term peace and quiet on the one hand, and also during the reconstruction of Gaza, and the humanitarian assistance that we are helping enter Gaza now, to ensure that that does not enable Hamas to rearm itself or to rebuild its terrorist capabilities. At the end of the day, we shouldn't forget Hamas is not only Israel's enemy. It's the enemy of the people of Gaza. It's the enemy of the Palestinian people. It's the enemy of all peace-seeking, dialogue, and reconciliation people in the region.
You say that, Jonathan, but we see the Western media, with very few exceptions. I'm proud to say this show is one of those exceptions. But most of the Western media constantly do this moral equivalence, saying, oh, no, Israel's just as bad or even worse than Hamas. I want to play you this clip by a character called John Oliver, who was then being exposed by an Israeli comedian, and he does a great job of exposing just how flawed this moral equivalence is. Just have a look at this, Ambassador.
It is. The citizens of Gaza don't have an Iron Dome to protect them the way that the citizens of Israel do. It's one of the many ways they're at a significant disadvantage. Both sides are firing rockets, but one side has one of the most advanced militaries in the world. Both sides are suffering heartbreaking casualties, but one side is suffering them exponentially.
Both sides love eating hummus, but one side is a terrorist organization deliberately targeting Israeli civilians, deliberately firing rockets from crowded population centers in Gaza, using Palestinian children as human shields, and the other side is not.
So, Ambassador, can you think of anything more absurd than that character John Oliver saying one side has Iron Dome and the other doesn't? Why do you think Israel has an Iron Dome? Because it had to build one, because for the last 20 years it's been constantly under attack. How insane are these people, Ambassador?
No, absolutely. And, you know, I think we're all forgetting, the people of Gaza are forgetting, they have the cheapest, simplest, most effective Iron Dome in the world.
Yes.
And it's called simply Stop Shooting. So we wouldn't need to develop and spend billions of dollars in an Iron Dome to protect ourselves in the first place, had we not had this terrorist regime backed by Iran on our back door in the south of Israel. But again, we'll continue. We believe in our cause. We are unfortunately accustomed to standing up and defending ourselves. And we're also at the same time achieving peace with our neighbors. We've achieved peace with Egypt. We've achieved peace with Jordan. We achieved peace with the Gulf states recently, the Abraham Accords. So there's definitely proof here that we can both defend ourselves at the same time and continue striving for peace together parallel.
Prime Minister Netanyahu threatened, as part of that brilliant strategic operation involving the tunnels, threatened to invade and retake Gaza. You mentioned Gaza's on the edges of Israel there. Israel gave Gaza to the Palestinians on the basis that they would get peace. At what point, Ambassador, would Benjamin Netanyahu's government feel we have to retake Gaza, even part of it, to protect ourselves?
We very much were reluctant. We will very much hope not to even reach that point. I think there are three options theoretically that you can discuss when countering such an issue. The first one is negotiation, which obviously is not on the table. Hamas calls for the destruction of us. You can't negotiate with somebody who wants to destruct you, and he doesn't want to negotiate with you. The second option is what the Allies did during World War II, when they basically razed cities, German and Japanese cities. That's an option which Israel would never even think of doing. That leaves us with really the only option on the table, which is to continue fighting Hamas, degrading its capabilities, and trying and hoping that finally the moderates in the Palestinian camp will throw out Hamas, that's terrorizing Israel and tyrannizing Gaza, throw Hamas out, and the world will be a better place, not only for Israelis, but for Palestinians as well.
James.
I want to ask your thoughts on the attitude of the Biden administration to all of this. I mean, we've seen a big change from the Trump administration, which was outspokenly pro-Israel. Have you sensed a change in the American disposition to Israel? What I saw was a lot of both sidesism from Joe Biden and, you know, kind of stepping back and then saying, well, both sides, you know, stop, rather than giving Israel a big vote of support. Have you noticed this change in the Biden administration, and are you guys worried about America's support shifting away from the peace processes that were started under the Trump administration and resuming that deal with Iran, which will, of course, ultimately strengthen Hamas, which is there in Gaza and had been firing rockets at you for the last fortnight?
Well, every U.S. administration obviously has a slightly different attitude. President Biden has been a long-standing friend of Israel, and I think despite the pressures within his own Democratic Party, has shown during this last conflict that he is committed to the security and the right of Israel to protect itself and defend itself. I think the United States did a very important job in the United Nations Security Council. So we really appreciate President Biden's and the U.S. administration's support of Israel. Obviously, we don't always agree with them, especially concerning how to deal with Iran, the nuclear deal which is being now negotiated, or proximity talks that are taking place now in Vienna. But a good friendship also enables us to be able to voice our opinions, sometimes to disagree on certain things, but at the end of the day to know we can count on the United States to support us and to help us defend ourselves and our right to protect our civilians.
Rita.
But the Democrats have got this radical arm which is strengthening and isn't being condemned for their very much anti-Israel views. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, they have just said some fairly appalling things that you could argue have incited violence against Jewish people or pro-Israel people. And yet they haven't had any condemnation from the other Democrats. Does that concern you?
Obviously, we are concerned to see public officials, opinion makers make declarations or take sides without really delving into the issue at hand, being based on a lot of biased and, I would say, ignorant media reports. There's a lot of incitement, a lot of disinformation around. What we are calling is for all those who are really interested in the Middle East and in Israel's security and safety and in the Palestinian cause to come to learn from close exactly what it's about and then to voice their opinions and their positions. Not just do it from the comfort and safety of their homes, wherever it is, based just on one-sided, biased and very often distorted reports that are coming in.
Ambassador, just one final quick question before we go. Shortly, James is going to be looking in particular at the hideous anti-Semitism that's occurred around the world. But what would you say to those Australian demonstrators, and there seem to be an awful lot of them, calling Israel an apartheid state?
Well, I think these demonstrators have no idea what apartheid is. I'm inviting them to come to Israel to see for themselves the coexistence between Arabs, Jews, Christians and Muslims and all faiths. There is no other democracy in the Middle East that has free expression, free worship, free press, just as Australia is. And I think people, until they come to Israel, don't really realize what's at stake. So I invite all these people to really look in deeper into what's going on and to come and see for themselves in Israel how coexistence really does work.
Fantastic. Ambassador Jonathan Peled, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders today.
Thank you very much for having me.